By sundown, the snowstorm had already swallowed the horizon, and the blizzard showed no signs of slowing. In the thick of the storm, one cowboy sat at his camp, hands hovering over a fire that seemed too fragile to survive the night. But this fire wasn't like any other. Before we ride further into this tale, let us know where you're tuning in from, and if you find frontier stories as captivating as the wild winds that howl through them, saddle up and subscribe for tomorrow's journey. The first gust of wind cut through the prairie just after sundown, biting through the air with a cold that seemed to reach into a man's bones. Ben Rust McAllister, wrapped tightly in his woolen blanket, squinted as the snow began to fall in thick, swirling sheets. What had started as a light dusting now gathered strength, turning into a full-blown blizzard within moments. The sky, once clear, vanished as the storm's fury took over the horizon. The world around him grew quieter, the usual hum of the wilderness drowned out by the wind's growl and the snowflakes that flew like white ghosts. Ben had seen enough storms to know this one wasn't going to pass quickly. The blizzard's howls intensified, a constant reminder of just how alone he was out here. His camp, simple yet familiar, was surrounded by nothing but the wide open prairie, the cold and the growing wall of snow that threatened to swallow him whole. His tent was secured, his horses tied and fed, the saddlebags safely tucked away. The fire he'd built was his only comfort against the freezing night ahead, but the wind was already testing it. The flames flickered, bending and swaying, fighting to stay alive against the storm's onslaught. Ben knew better than to underestimate what the wind could do, especially on a night like this. He bent down and grabbed the last bundle of dry kindling, his hands moving with a practiced ease. He had learned the hard way that in the wilderness a fire could be the difference between survival and death. His eyes darted from the fire to the horizon, watching as the storm crept closer, knowing that he couldn't let his attention stray for too long. Every second counted. The wind howled once more, sweeping through the camp, and Ben adjusted the logs in the fire, stacking them just so, adding more fuel to keep it burning strong. He took the time, carefully placing each piece, ensuring it would burn steadily through the night. The fire was his companion now, steady, warm, and his sole means of survival. Ben didn't mind the cold. It was a part of life out here. But he knew the blizzard would get worse before it got better. He could feel the temperature dropping, the wind picking up speed, biting through the layers of his coat, as the fire flickered desperately. But he would not let it die. Not tonight. Not in the middle of this storm. With a deep breath, Ben settled back into his blanket, eyes still fixed on the fire. The snow was already deep, and the world outside was starting to disappear, the blizzard swallowing it whole. His hands, worn and calloused, moved again to adjust the fire, ensuring the flames stayed alive. He wasn't going to let the storm have this one. Through the rising wind, he could hear the wolves' now distant howls, but closer than they had been before. The coyotes would follow. He wasn't afraid of the wildlife, but tonight the storm was his real adversary, and it had a way of making everything else feel smaller in comparison. Ben's focus stayed on the fire, knowing it would have to outlast the night. As the storm raged on, his thoughts drifted to past winters, those long, brutal nights when survival had been much harder. He had learned much in those years about fire, about the land, and about the unforgiving nature of the wilderness. Tonight, though, the lesson was simple. If that fire went out, he wouldn't make it through. The wind picked up again, but this time Ben didn't flinch. He had learned how to withstand this, how to bend to the land instead of fighting it. He knew how to make his fire burn. And as the storm grew fiercer, he sat still, watching the flames dance, knowing that the storm might rage, but tonight it would not win. Ben sat by the fire, the wind howling around him, carrying the thick snowflakes in a vicious swirl. The storm had grown stronger, biting through the night like a wild animal, yet the fire flickered defiantly in front of him. It wasn't just a fire, it was his lifeline, his only chance to survive the blizzard that was now consuming the world beyond his camp. The hollowed-out log he'd placed around the fire shielded it from the worst of the wind, but that wasn't enough. Ben had learned long ago that fire could be the difference between life and death in these conditions. The slightest mistake could leave him freezing under the stars. He'd spent years perfecting his technique, ensuring his fires burned steady even in the fiercest storms. Ben's hands moved methodically, adding more wood to the flames, ensuring the fire didn't die out. The wind howled again, rattling the trees, and the snowflakes thickened, making the night feel like an endless white abyss. But Ben didn't flinch. He had faced worse, much worse. He knew that if the fire went out, he'd be lost. The horses, Buck and Scout, huddled near the fire, their breath steaming in the cold air. Ben didn't take his eyes off the flames as he worked, knowing the horses would be fine for now. The storm wasn't their fight. Tonight, the fight was his. He reached for another piece of kindling, adding it carefully, watching as the flames danced higher. The fire was slow burning, but strong, just as he'd planned. The cowboy's mind drifted for a moment, his thoughts flickering back to the colder nights he'd endured in the past. He had learned to respect the wilderness the way it could break a man if he wasn't careful, the way it could turn a simple mistake into a fatal one. He'd seen men die from foolish errors, from underestimating the frontier's power. Ben's fire wasn't just a source of warmth, it was a statement. He was a part of this wild, unforgiving land, but it didn't own him. He'd learned to bend to it, to use its challenges to his advantage. His fire would survive. The storm could rage all it wanted, but it wouldn't take his warmth tonight. Minutes stretched on, then hours. The storm only grew fiercer, but the fire remained steady. It crackled and popped, sending sparks into the blizzard, but it burned bright and strong. Ben leaned back slightly, letting the warmth seep into his bones. The night was long, and the storm would not stop, but the fire would stay. It had to. Ben stared into the flames, knowing that as long as the fire held, so would he. The storm was relentless, but so was he. The snow kept falling, heavier now, but Ben didn't move. His eyes never left the fire, the dancing flames casting long shadows that stretched across the camp. The wind howled, cutting through the air with an intensity that made the world feel like it was being torn apart. Yet the fire stood firm, crackling steadily, as if mocking the storm's fury. Ben huddled deeper into his blanket, pulling it tighter around his shoulders, but his gaze remained fixed on the flames. The cold was starting to creep into his bones, but he refused to let the fire go out. He had seen too many men freeze in the wild, their mistakes costing them everything. He wasn't about to be one of them. The wind screamed louder, a deafening force that rattled the trees and howled through the empty spaces around him. Snowflakes stung his face whenever he dared to glance away from the fire. Ben didn't mind it. He'd spent enough winters to know how to endure the storm's bite. What mattered was the fire. It was his shield against the freezing night, his last defense against the wilderness. Ben reached out and poked at the fire with a long stick, pushing the embers back into the center. The logs shifted with a soft crack, but the flame held steady. He wasn't about to let it falter now. The storm would pass, just like all the others had. But if he couldn't keep the fire burning, it would be the end of him. His thoughts wandered back to past storms. He'd ridden through countless blizzards in his time on the trail, but none had tested him like this one. The wind howled like a wild animal, and the snow fell so thick it seemed like the world had vanished entirely. Ben had been alone in storms before, but something about this one felt different. It was as if the land itself was pushing against him, daring him to fail. He could hear the wolves in the distance, their cries barely audible over the storm. They were out there, hunting, searching for something to feed their hunger. Ben had no intention of becoming their next meal. His fire was his protection, his lifeline, and he would do whatever it took to keep it alive. The hours stretched on, the minutes feeling like an eternity. The fire burned steady, but the storm didn't let up. The snow had already drifted deep around the camp, and the night seemed to stretch longer with each passing moment. But Ben didn't mind. He had endured worse. In fact, he welcomed the challenge. As the hours wore on, the wind howled even louder. But Ben didn't waver. He knew this was just another test, just another night on the frontier. The fire was still burning, and so was he. The storm didn't let up. The wind howled, furious and unrelenting, while the snow continued to fall in thick, blinding sheets. Ben sat unmoving by the fire, watching as the flames flickered and danced in the dark. His fingers were numb, the cold creeping through the layers of his coat, but he didn't move. He couldn't afford to. The fire was his only chance of survival tonight, and he would keep it alive for as long as possible. The wolves had grown quieter. Their cries, once distant and eerie, had faded with the rising wind. Ben knew that meant one thing. They were getting closer. The pack was out there, somewhere in the dark, drawn to the scent of a lone cowboy trapped by a blizzard. Ben wasn't worried. Not yet. He had faced worse. But he wasn't foolish either. He knew how dangerous the wolves could be when hunger drove them. The night was long, the storm showing no signs of slowing. Ben couldn't see beyond the firelight now, the storm swallowing everything around him. He shifted slightly, trying to keep the warmth of the fire close, but it was harder now. The cold wasn't just outside, it was inside, creeping into his bones. He reached for the flask at his belt, taking a long sip of whiskey to fight the cold and the weariness that was threatening to drag him under. The warmth spread through him, dulling the sharp edge of the chill, but it didn't last long. His thoughts returned to the fire, watching the flames sputter and shift, throwing off tiny sparks that were quickly snatched away by the storm. The fire was still strong, but Ben knew it couldn't last forever. The wolves were still out there. Their presence was a constant pull at the back of his mind. He had heard them close earlier, the sound of their howls cutting through the night like a sharp blade. Now, though, they were silent. The quiet made his skin crawl. The pack was close. Ben listened harder, straining his ears against the storm, but there was nothing, not even the faintest sound. He reached down and adjusted the fire again, pushing a few logs closer to the center. The warmth flickered back to life, pushing back the chill, but the quiet weighed heavily on him. Then, a sound, barely audible over the wind, but it was there. A low, deep growl coming from the edge of the camp. Ben's hand instinctively went to the rifle beside him. He didn't turn toward the sound. He didn't need to. He could feel it, the shift in the air, the threat that was drawing nearer. The wolves weren't just waiting anymore. They were circling. Ben's grip tightened on his rifle. The storm was pushing against him, but tonight he would fight back. He would not go down quietly. The storm raged through the night, relentless and fierce. Ben sat motionless, his eyes fixed on the fire, which had begun to flicker weakly in the early hours. The wolves had circled for what felt like hours, their howls cutting through the wind. Ben didn't flinch. He couldn't afford to. He kept his rifle close, his hand never straying far from it. But his focus was on the fire. The wolves would wait for an opening, but they weren't getting it tonight. The hours passed slowly, each minute stretching into eternity. The fire had burned down to embers, and Ben had been forced to add more wood to keep the heat steady. The cold had crept deeper into his bones, but he fought it with each log he placed on the fire. Each piece of wood was another chance to survive, another hour he could hold off the storm and the creatures that stalked the edges of his camp. The wolves had stopped circling after a while, their growls fading into the distance. The quiet was almost worse than the howls. Ben knew they were still out there, just waiting. But the night had passed, and with it, the storm had finally begun to show signs of relenting. The winds died down, and the snow, which had fallen in thick sheets, began to lighten. The sky, though still overcast, seemed less oppressive. The storm was breaking. By dawn, the fire had burned down to little more than a few glowing embers. The storm had cleared the landscape around him, leaving behind a blanket of fresh snow, untouched and pure. Ben stood, stretching stiff muscles, the cold biting at his skin. The storm had passed, but the remnants of the night were still there, hanging in the air like an unspoken warning. He adjusted his gear, the weight of the cold setting in now that the fire was dying. The horses, buckled to their posts, snorted in the cold air, their breath steaming like faint clouds. Ben glanced over at them, making sure they were secure, before he turned his attention to the surroundings. The wolves had kept their distance. but they were never far, and that knowledge made his skin prickle. He was alone out here, and the storm had reminded him of just how fragile that solitude was. With the fire now reduced to ash, Ben packed up his camp. The storm had tested him, but he had held his ground. The fire had kept him warm through the worst of it, and now, as the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, he could see that the wilderness had not claimed him. Not this time. He packed the last of his gear, buckled his rifle tight, and stood by his horses, ready to move on. The day was beginning, the storm fading into the past, but Ben knew better than to let his guard down. The frontier was always waiting to test him again. As he set off into the open snow, the faint warmth of the dying fire in his chest, Ben didn't look back. He knew that the storm was only a memory now, but the wilderness would always be out there, silent, watching, waiting for the next man who thought he could survive it. The day had broken clear and cold, the early morning sun casting long shadows across the untouched snow. Ben's boots crunched into the fresh powder as he led Buck and Scout across the open plain. The storm had passed, but its remnants lingered in the bitter air and the silence that stretched across the land. The howl of the wind was gone, replaced by the quiet, steady rhythm of Ben's footsteps. The storm had been a reminder, a hard lesson learned yet again. There was no room for complacency out here. The frontier had its rules, and they were simple: survive, or you didn't last long. Ben had learned that lesson the hard way over the years, and though the fire had kept him alive through the night, he knew it could have easily gone the other way. One wrong move, one slip of attention, and the cold would have claimed him, just like it had claimed so many others before him. His mind drifted back to the fire, to the way it had flickered and cracked throughout the night, holding firm against the storm. It had been more than just a fire to him. It was a symbol of everything he had learned in his years on the trail. Patience, preparation, persistence. The fire, steady and constant, had been his only companion in that blizzard, a small flame in a vast, unforgiving world. He glanced over at Scout, the smaller, quicker horse, trotting along beside him. Scout's ears were perked, sensing the change in the air as the storm slowly lifted. Ben had always trusted his horses. They had helped him out of tight spots more than once, and they knew how to handle the wilds of the frontier. Buck, the larger, sturdier horse, snorted and shook his mane, kicking up a cloud of snow behind him. Ben gave him a pat on the neck, appreciating the steady animal's calm demeanor. They had traveled 1,000 miles together, through heat, dust, and snow, but the night before had reminded Ben just how fragile their world was. He couldn't take anything for granted, not the fire, not his horses, not the land. Everything out here was always on the edge, just a little too close to slipping away. As they moved through the snow, Ben thought about the stranger he had encountered years ago in a similar storm. The man had been much like him, alone in the wilderness, trying to make it through a blizzard. But unlike Ben, the man hadn't prepared enough, hadn't thought ahead. He'd miscalculated the severity of the storm, and it had cost him. Ben had found the man's body in the snow the next morning, frozen solid. It had been a sobering reminder that in this life, survival was never guaranteed. You had to earn it. Ben's eyes narrowed as he scanned the horizon. The storm had passed, but the lesson lingered. He had survived. He would survive again, but only if he kept learning. The sun was high now, the sky clear and bright as the storm's aftermath stretched across the horizon. Ben kept his eyes on the ground, letting Buck and Scout find their way through the deep snow. The horses' hooves left wide prints behind them, sinking into the soft powder with every step. The storm had left its mark on the land, but now it was as if the world had been scrubbed clean, the quiet after the chaos, a palpable weight in the air. Ben hadn't intended to go far today. He'd planned to make camp early, let the horses rest and warm up. But something was pulling him forward, some instinct he couldn't quite name. It was the land the wilderness always called to him, especially after a storm, when everything felt renewed and vast. His bones, worn from years on the trail, yearned for the open space. As the hours passed, Ben began to notice the stillness. The air was too quiet. Even the wind had stopped howling. The wolves, once distant, had disappeared entirely. It wasn't like the usual silence of the wild, the calm before the storm, or the peace after one had passed. This felt different, unnerving, even. Ben had been on enough trails to recognize when something was out of place. He pulled his coat tighter, glancing back at the horses. They seemed calm enough, but there was something in their stance that made Ben's hand drift to the rifle slung across his back. They were nervous, their ears flicking toward the forest. The snow was too deep to leave much of a trail, but Ben knew that sometimes the land didn't give up its secrets easily. Then, as if summoned by the quiet, the sound came a low, distant whinny. The horses startled, their heads jerking up at the noise. Ben paused, listening. The whinny was followed by another, closer this time. His instincts kicked in. Someone or something was out there. Ben glanced at his horses, who were now twitching with unease. He looked around. The wild landscape stretched before him, but all he could see were the endless drifts of snow and the frozen trees. The wind had dropped, but the air was still thick with the weight of it. The sound of hoofbeats followed, faint but steady, coming from the north. Ben hesitated only a moment before he moved toward the sound. It was a risk, but he wasn't about to ignore a fellow traveler if someone else was caught in the storm. He wasn't the type to leave someone to die out here, not after the lessons the frontier had taught him. The horse's nervousness only deepened as the sound grew louder. Ben's grip on his rifle tightened, his steps steady but cautious. He knew the wilderness could be treacherous, and no one out here would hesitate to take advantage of a lone cowboy. The whinnies grew louder, closer. Ben slowed his pace, his eyes scanning the snow-covered trees. Whoever it was, they weren't far. Ben crept forward, his boots barely making a sound on the snow. The hoofbeats were growing louder, but so was the stillness around him. His heart beat steady in his chest, the sound of it mingling with the faint whispers of wind that had begun to pick up again. He hadn't yet seen the rider, but the closer he got, the more certain he became that this wasn't some wild animal. Someone was out there, just on the other side of the thicket. The horses, now uneasy, had begun to fidget, their heads swiveling nervously in the direction of the noise. Ben's eyes narrowed as he paused, taking a moment to consider his next move. He didn't know whether the rider was friend or foe, but out here, trust didn't come easily. The frontier made men do desperate things. He moved closer to the edge of the trees, careful to stay out of sight. A few more steps, and he'd be able to make out the rider. He slowed, crouching low to the ground as he approached. The whinnies had stopped, and now all Ben could hear was the crunch of hooves in snow, sharp and rhythmic. Whoever it was, they were close. Then the rider appeared, a figure dressed in a dark coat, head bowed against the wind. The snow had begun to fall again, lighter this time, but enough to make the scene seem dreamlike, as if the land itself were trying to erase all signs of humanity. Ben watched for a moment, unseen, studying the rider's movements. The rider, a man in his late 30s or early 40s, appeared worn but steady. His clothes were tattered, and his face was gaunt, as if he hadn't seen a hot meal or a warm bed in some time. Ben couldn't make out many details from his position, but one thing was clear: the man was struggling, his horse stumbling slightly in the deep snow. He was alone. Ben considered for a moment. The frontier didn't give second chances to men who didn't take care of themselves, but this rider was still alive. That meant he had some fight left in him. With a deep breath, Ben stepped from behind the thicket, rifle still slung across his back, and called out, "You lost, stranger?" The rider froze at the sound of his voice, his eyes widening in recognition or maybe suspicion. Ben held his ground, not moving a step closer. He knew how fragile moments like this could be. The man took a step back, hand going instinctively to the side of his saddle as if reaching for a weapon. Ben's eyes flicked to the man's movements but didn't react. He had no intention of starting trouble. "I'm just trying to find my way," the rider called back, his voice hoarse from the cold. "And get out of this damn storm." Ben nodded slightly. The man wasn't armed in a way that made Ben feel threatened, but he knew the look of a man who'd seen too many storms. The question was whether he'd made it through this one. "I've got shelter," Ben said, finally moving toward the rider. "You can rest for a while." The man hesitated, then slowly nodded, his weary face softening. "I'd appreciate that. Name's Wade Lawson. Ben McAllister," Ben replied. He gestured to the horses. "Come on, let's get you out of the cold." Ben led Wade toward the fire, his boots crunching in the fresh snow, the storm's remnants still hanging in the air like a thick, oppressive weight. The storm had passed, but the night's chill lingered, biting through the air with a quiet vengeance. The horses followed behind them, the steady sound of their hooves in the snow almost comforting in its simplicity. As they approached the camp, the flickering firelight cast long shadows against the snow, and Ben's breath rose in clouds, hanging for a moment before it disappeared into the wind. Wade, now closer, looked every bit the part of a man who had been on the edge for far too long. His clothes were ragged, and his face had the hollow look of someone who hadn't slept in days. Yet, despite his exhaustion, there was something about his posture stiff and wary that told Ben this wasn't his first storm either. Ben motioned toward the fire. "Sit," he said, his voice steady. "I'll see to your horse." Wade nodded silently, taking a seat beside the flames. He rubbed his gloved hands together, leaning forward into the warmth. Ben had already seen enough to know Wade was in no condition to do much more than rest. His horse was tired, its coat covered in frost, but it had kept pace with the storm, just like its rider. Ben took a moment to check the horses, leading them into the shelter of a nearby stand of trees. As he unbuckled the saddles and fed them what little hay he had left, he could feel the weight of the night pulling at him. The storm had been hard on them both, but it was clear now that Wade was in worse shape than he had let on. Ben had seen the signs. The desperation in his eyes, the way he'd walked with uneven steps, the hollow ring of his voice. He finished with the horses quickly and returned to the fire. Wade was sitting up now, the exhaustion still evident in the way his shoulders hunched, but his face had softened a little. He looked up as Ben approached, his tired eyes grateful but guarded. "Thanks," Wade muttered, his voice hoarse from the cold. "I wasn't sure I'd make it through." Ben sat down on the opposite side of the fire, feeling the warmth begin to soak into his bones. He didn't respond right away, simply watching the fire flicker and crackle in the silence between them. There was no need for words, not yet. The storm had taken its toll on them both, and they didn't need to explain it. The wilderness was a quiet teacher, and its lessons didn't always come with words. After a long moment, Wade broke the silence. "What brings you out here?" he asked, his voice still hoarse but with a genuine curiosity. Ben glanced up from the fire, his gaze distant as he thought about the question. "Same as you, I reckon," he said after a pause. "Surviving." Wade's eyes dropped to the fire, and for a moment the two men sat in companionable silence. The storm was behind them now, but both of them knew that out here it was never far away. The fire burned low, its embers crackling in the stillness of the night, as Ben and Wade sat in silence. The wind had died down, leaving behind only the soft whisper of snowflakes falling from the trees. The storm had passed, but the wilderness had a way of lingering in the bones, reminding men like Ben that survival was never guaranteed. Wade shifted uneasily by the fire, his eyes flickering to the horses in the distance. "You plan on staying out here long?" he asked, his voice still rough from the cold. Ben took a slow breath, the warmth of the fire easing the tightness in his chest. He didn't answer immediately. It wasn't the kind of question that had an easy answer. The land didn't ask questions, and neither did he. When the wilderness called, Ben answered. When it gave him a moment of peace, he held on to it, however fleeting. But there was always more ahead, more cold, more storms, more wilderness. There was no such thing as staying still out here. "I'll leave when I'm ready," Ben replied, his eyes never leaving the fire. Wade nodded, a small, tired smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "I guess that's all we really can do out here. Leave when we're ready, or when we're forced to." Ben's gaze shifted to Wade. The man had a way of speaking that made it clear he had seen much in his time, maybe even more than Ben. He wasn't a man to settle, just like Ben. But something in his eyes, now something raw and open, made Ben wonder if the storm had taken more than just the cold from him. "I've been running a long time," Wade said, almost to himself, staring into the flames. "Maybe it's time to stop." Ben stayed quiet, letting the words hang in the air. There was no need to say anything more. Sometimes the wilderness forced men to run, but it also gave them space to stop when they were ready. It wasn't the place for easy answers, and there was no room for pity. The night stretched on, and Wade eventually drifted off into a fitful sleep, his body worn from the storm and the journey. Ben, though, stayed awake. He never slept easy after a storm, not when he knew that the wilderness was waiting for him to make the next move. The frontier wasn't about comfort. It was about survival, about taking each day as it came. No more, no less. Ben pulled his blanket tighter around his shoulders, feeling the chill creep back into his bones. The fire had burned down to a few scattered embers, but the night was still alive, with the sounds of the wilderness, distant howls, the rustling of the trees, the soft crunch of snow underfoot. He glanced at the horizon, watching as the first faint light of dawn broke through the clouds. The storm was over. The wilderness was waiting. Ben stood up slowly, his muscles stiff, but his resolve steady. He'd make his way forward, just like he always had. The wilderness was unforgiving, but it was his home.